The text came through while she was in the shower, and I wasn't trying to see it. I want to be clear about that from the start because what happened after wasn't the result of me snooping. It was the result of her phone lighting up on the kitchen counter 6 inches from where I was rinsing a coffee mug. Greg, see you at 7. Same place. My name is Marcus and I teach 11th grade history at Prairie View High School, and I have spent 17 years training myself to read primary sources for what they actually say rather than what I want them to say. I read that text 3 times standing at my own sink, and each time it said the exact same thing, and each time I told myself it meant something else. Same place could mean the office. Same place could mean the conference room where her quarterly reviews always ran long. I built that explanation in about 4 seconds, the way you catch a falling object before you've even registered you're reaching for it, and I want you to know I believed it mostly for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Sandra and I had been married 11 years. We had 2 kids. Noah, 9, all elbows and questions, and Lily, 5, who still climbed into our bed some mornings smelling like sleep and crayons. We lived in a decent split level on the east side of Cedar Rapids that we bought the year Noah was born, the kind of house with a half-finished basement project that had been almost done for 6 years running. Sandra had spent most of our marriage in mid-level marketing jobs, competent and underpaid, until 8 months earlier when she'd been promoted to senior account director at Halverson Creative, the agency where she'd worked for the past 4 years. The promotion had come with a 15% raise, a corner desk instead of a cubicle, and a new direct supervisor, Greg Bennett, the VP of Client Services, a man I had met exactly twice at company holiday parties and remembered as tall, tan in a way that suggested a gym membership and very little Iowa winter, and possessed of the specific confidence of a man who has never once doubted that a room was lucky to have him in it. "You good?" Sandra asked, coming into the kitchen in her robe, towel drying her hair, and I realized I'd been standing at the sink holding the same mug for probably 45 seconds. "Yeah," I said, just zoned out. "Big test to grade today." "You've got that face," she said, not unkindly, kissing my cheek on her way to the coffee pot. "The one where you're already mentally somewhere else." She wasn't wrong. I was already somewhere else, replaying the text, doing the quiet arithmetic of 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. Same place, sent by her boss, received with a small private smile she didn't know I'd caught a glimpse of through the bathroom doorway before she'd silenced the screen and tucked the phone into her robe pocket. I told myself the smile was about something else entirely. Client win. A joke from a coworker forwarded into the wrong thread. I had 100 explanations and not one of them was the truth, and the worst part, the part I'd come to sit with much later, was how easily I generated them, how practiced I already was at not looking directly at things that scared me. That evening she did, in fact, work late. She texted around 6:30. "Client dinner ran long. Don't wait up, eat without me." I made grilled cheese for the kids, helped Noah with a worksheet on state capitals, read Lily 2 books about a dinosaur who couldn't find his shoe, and put them both to bed by 8:30, and the whole time, underneath the ordinary mechanics of a Tuesday evening with 2 kids, that text sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. Same place, as if there were a place. As if this wasn't the first time. She came home at 11:15, smelling faintly of wine and something else underneath it. A warmth, a heaviness to her perfume that I couldn't place and didn't try very hard to. She climbed into bed beside me, careful, quiet, assuming I was asleep, and I lay there with my eyes closed, listening to her breathing slow, and I thought, I am a man who has just been lied to, and I don't yet know by how much. I didn't say anything. I told myself I'd bring it up when I had more than a feeling, more than a text glimpsed over a coffee mug. It would take me 11 more weeks to gather the courage to actually look. The weeks after that Tuesday folded back into the ordinary rhythm of a household running on autopilot. Noah's soccer practices, Lily's kindergarten art projects taped to the fridge, my own evenings consumed by essay grading and JV basketball practice, since I'd taken on coaching duties that fall on top of my teaching load. I want to be honest that I let myself get swallowed by that workload partly because it was real and partly because it gave me somewhere to put my attention that wasn't the question sitting quietly at the back of my skull. Sandra's promotion had genuinely changed her schedule, and that made everything that followed easier to explain away. Late nights became normal. Client dinners, stakeholder calls that ran into the evening, an off-site strategy session. All plausible. All things that happen in marketing. All things I had zero frame of reference to question because I'd spent my whole adult life in a profession where the day ends when the bell rings and doesn't usually involve anyone named Greg texting you about the usual place at dinner time. I noticed, though, the way the late nights clustered specifically around Tuesdays and Thursdays, never Mondays, never Fridays, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence once I'd actually started paying attention, which I did slowly, almost against my will, the way you notice a draft in a house and can't stop feeling it once you have. I noticed she'd started doing her makeup differently on those mornings. More careful, a little more done than her usual quick routine for the office. I noticed a new lipstick in her bag, a deep wine color she'd never worn before. That showed up sometime in late September, and that I never once saw on her in the evenings, only ever on the mornings of a client day. I didn't ask. This is the part of myself I find hardest to look at now. I have spent my career teaching teenagers that history happens because people either ask the hard questions or they don't, that entire empires have fallen because someone in power decided ignorance was more comfortable than confrontation, and I sat inside my own small domestic version of that exact failure for months, lecturing 17-year-olds about the cost of denial during the day and practicing it religiously at home every night. Noah, oddly, was the one who first said something that lodged itself in me the way a splinter does. Small, easy to ignore, impossible to fully forget. Mom's on her phone a lot at the soccer field, he said one Saturday in October, watching cartoons, not even looking up. She smiles at it weird. Smiles weird how? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He shrugged, 9 years old and already bored of the topic. Like when she's not telling you the joke. I let it go. I told myself kids say strange specific things all the time, that it didn't mean anything, even as some small cold current ran through me and didn't fully leave for the rest of the day. Sandra started talking about Greg more, too, in the offhand, frequent way people talk about someone who's taken up real space in their daily life without them quite noticing how much space. Greg thinks we should pitch the redesign differently. Greg actually backed me up in the meeting today, which never happens with Denise. Greg said something funny at lunch, and then a pause, a small laugh, a wave of her hand. Never mind, it's an office thing, you wouldn't think it's funny. I'd nod along, genuinely glad, on some surface level, that she had an ally at work, someone who saw her competence and rewarded it after years of being overlooked. I told myself that was a good thing, a healthy thing. I didn't let myself follow the thread further than that, because following it further meant arriving somewhere I didn't want to be. In November, I found a hotel key card in the side pocket of her overnight bag while looking for a phone charger before a work trip of my own. A teacher's conference in Des Moines I'd be attending for 2 days. The card was from the Crestwood Suites, a business hotel near the Halverson Creative offices, dated with a small sticker showing a checkout time 3 days prior. A Thursday, one of her late nights. I held the card for a long moment, turning it over, feeling the cheap plastic edge against my thumb, and told myself a story. Company retreat, maybe, or she'd needed somewhere quiet to finish a presentation. Agencies did that sometimes, didn't they? Booked a room for focused work. I put the card back exactly where I'd found it and did not mention it, and I left for my own conference 2 days later carrying that key card in my mind the entire drive to Des Moines, turning the story over and over, trying to make it hold together and finding every single time a seam that didn't quite close. By Thanksgiving, the pattern had a shape I could no longer pretend not to see, even if I still hadn't said a single word about it out loud. Tuesday and Thursday late nights. A new lipstick that appeared only on those mornings. A hotel key card from a hotel 5 minutes from her office that she'd never mentioned staying at. A name, Greg, that had migrated from my boss to a near-constant presence in casual dinner conversation. And underneath all of it, my own daughter's offhand observation that her mother smiled at her phone the way you smile at a joke you don't want to share. I sat at Thanksgiving dinner that year, surrounded by Sandra's parents and my own brother and his wife, watching Sandra laugh at something on her phone under the table, quick, private, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me, I already know. I just haven't let myself know it yet. December brought the company holiday party, the one event each year where I actually crossed paths with the people who populated Sandra's work stories. And it was there, watching Greg Bennett work a crowded room in a navy blazer that fit a little too well for a man his age, that suspicion stopped being something I carried privately and became something I could no longer separate from how I watched my own wife move through a room. He came over to introduce himself partway through the evening, shook my hand with the kind of grip that's calibrated to feel firm without trying too hard, and said, "Marcus, right?" Sandra talks about you and the kids all the time. You teach history. I always wished I'd paid more attention to that stuff in school. Easy charm, practiced, the sort of thing a man says 100 times a year to 100 different spouses. I smiled and said something forgettable back, and the whole interaction lasted maybe 90 seconds, and I spent every one of those seconds watching Sandra's posture change slightly the moment he walked up. Not dramatically, nothing anyone else in the room would have caught, just a faint straightening, a slight angling of her body toward him that she didn't do toward anyone else at the party, including me. Later that night, across the room, I watched the two of them in conversation near the bar. Nothing inappropriate on the surface, just two colleagues talking, except for the particular quality of how long it lasted, and the way Sandra touched her own collarbone twice during the conversation. A gesture I recognized because I'd seen it exactly once before, 11 years ago, on our second date, when she was nervous and trying not to show it. I didn't say anything that night. I drove us home with Sandra slightly tipsy and warm beside me, talking about office gossip, about Denise's bad behavior in the budget meeting, about how good the shrimp cocktail had been, and I made all the right sounds in all the right places and felt, the entire drive, like I was watching myself from somewhere just outside my own body. The week after the party, the pattern accelerated in small, specific ways. Sandra started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running. Something she'd never done before, ever in 11 years. I noticed she'd started keeping her phone face down on the nightstand, screen toward the wood, when she used to leave it face up without a second thought. Once, helping her carry groceries in, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket and she reached for it so fast, so reflexively, that she nearly dropped a bag of oranges across the driveway, and when I asked, lightly, "Everything okay?" she said, "Yeah, just a client thing," in a voice that came out a half step too fast. I started keeping a kind of mental ledger, the historian in me unable to stop cataloging evidence even when every new entry made my chest hurt a little more. The Tuesday/Thursday pattern held steady into January. A new perfume showed up, heavier, more expensive than her usual drugstore brand. Something she said a coworker had given her as a just because gift, which struck me, even then, as an oddly specific kind of generosity between colleagues. She started going to the gym more, 3 mornings a week before work, which I genuinely welcomed at first, telling myself she just wanted to feel good in her new role, before I noticed she'd started doing her hair more carefully on gym mornings too, in a way that made very little sense for someone about to sweat through a workout. In late January, Lily, 5 years old and entirely without guile, said something at dinner that landed in me like a dropped glass. "Mommy's friend at work gave her flowers," she announced, apropos of nothing, stabbing at her macaroni. "I saw them in her car. Pink ones." Sandra's fork paused for half a second, that's all it was, but I caught it the way you catch the smallest hitch in a record skipping before she said easily, "Oh, that was from the whole team, sweetie, for closing the Hartman account. Daddy, can you pass the broccoli?" The deflection was smooth, immediate, practiced in a way that made the back of my neck go cold, because a true innocent explanation doesn't usually arrive that fast, that polished, with a subject change already loaded in the chamber. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in my car in the garage. Not going anywhere, just sitting, the engine off, the cold seeping in slowly through the door panels, and I let myself, for the first time, say the sentence out loud, alone, to no one. "She's having an affair." Saying it changed nothing about the facts I already had, but it changed everything about what I was going to have to do next, because a suspicion you haven't spoken, even to yourself, can still be managed, deferred, lived alongside. A suspicion you've said out loud demands action, and I sat in that cold garage for 40 minutes, not crying, just breathing, feeling the particular vertigo of a man standing at the edge of something he can't yet see the bottom of. I didn't sleep well for the next week, and somewhere in that week, the historian in me, the part of my brain trained to never accept a claim without a source, decided I needed more than a pattern of small, deniable details. I needed something undeniable, something that would hold up against whatever explanation Sandra was inevitably going to construct, because I already knew, with a teacher's instinct for student excuses, that she would have one ready the moment I asked. I started, modestly, by checking our joint credit card statements with new eyes, something I technically had equal access to but had never once scrutinized in 11 years of marriage, because there had never been a reason to. Buried in December's charges, I found 2 transactions from a hotel bar called the Aldermere Lounge, downtown, each for amounts too large for a solo drink. $68, then $91. Both on Thursday evenings, both billed to a corporate card she'd later told me Halverson reimbursed her for client entertainment, which would have been a perfectly reasonable explanation except that I'd never once heard her mention entertaining a client at a hotel bar, only ever at the steakhouse downtown where the agency had a standing account. I looked up the Aldermere Lounge. It was attached to the Crestwood Suites, the same hotel as the keycard I'd found in November. I sat with that connection for 2 full days before I did anything else with it, the way you sit with a diagnosis before you're ready to look up survival rates. Then, on a Tuesday in early February, one of her late nights, team strategy session running long, I told my mother I needed her to watch the kids for the evening, claimed a fictitious parent-teacher conference of my own, and drove downtown to the Crestwood Suites. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 45 minutes before I saw her car pull in at 6:52, and I watched her go inside, alone, dressed not in her work blazer but in a different outfit entirely. Something she must have changed into in the car or at the office. Something I'd never seen, dark green, more fitted than anything in her usual wardrobe. At 7:04, I watched Greg Bennett's silver SUV pull into the lot and park 3 spaces from hers, and I watched him go inside. I want to tell you that I confronted them right there, walked in, made a scene, demanded answers in the lobby of a downtown hotel. I didn't. I sat in my car for another hour watching the lobby doors, feeling something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. A stillness that frightened me more than rage would have, because rage at least feels like something is still alive in you. At 8:15, I saw them through the lounge window, visible from the parking lot at a particular angle, sitting close together at the bar, her hand resting briefly on his forearm before she pulled it back, laughing at something, the specific easy intimacy of 2 people who have done this enough times that it no longer requires nervousness. I drove home. I didn't say anything to her when she came in at 11, smelling like wine and that new perfume, climbing into bed beside me with the same careful quiet as always. I lay there with my eyes closed, and for the first time, I let myself fully feel the size of what I now knew, instead of managing it down into something smaller and more survivable. Over the following 2 weeks, I gathered what I needed methodically, the way I'd grade a stack of essays, thoroughly, without rushing, building a case I could stand behind. I photographed the credit card statements, highlighting the Aldermere Lounge charges. I found 3 more, going back to October, that I'd missed the first time because I hadn't yet known what I was looking for. I checked her work calendar one evening while she was in the shower. She'd left her laptop open on the kitchen table, careless for once, and found a recurring entry every Tuesday and Thursday, labeled simply GB, debrief. That didn't correspond to any client name on any account I'd ever heard her mention. I found, in the depths of her car's center console, a second hotel key card, this one for a room number, 412, handwritten on the paper sleeve in a hand that wasn't hers, a habit some hotels still had of writing the room number for guests who'd ask, and I sat in my own driveway holding that small piece of cardboard, feeling something in me finally, fully, irreversibly accept what I'd been circling for 4 months. The hardest piece came almost by accident. Noah, looking for a tablet charger in his mother's purse one Saturday while I was in the next room, called out, "Dad, what's this?" and held up a small velvet box he'd found tucked into an inner pocket. Inside was a bracelet, delicate, gold, clearly expensive, clearly not anything I'd given her and clearly not anything she'd buy for herself with the casual frugality she'd always brought to her own spending. I told Noah it was probably a surprise for a friend and put it back exactly where he'd found it. My hands steadier than I expected, and that evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a folder of printed statements, photographed calendar entries, and a photograph I'd taken of the bracelet before returning it to its hiding place, and I understood that I had everything I needed except the actual conversation, and that conversation was the only thing left standing between me and a life I no longer recognized. I decided to wait 1 more week. Not out of mercy, but because Lily had a school recital that Friday, and some stubborn, exhausted part of me wanted 1 more ordinary family evening before everything detonated. I sat in the front row of a kindergarten music recital watching my daughter sing a song about the solar system slightly off-key. Sandra beside me clapping enthusiastically, Noah bored in the seat on my other side, and I thought, this might be the last normal thing we ever do as a family, and I let myself feel that fully, right there in a folding chair in a school gymnasium, before I went home and started planning exactly how I was going to do what came next. I confronted her on a Sunday afternoon in late February, deliberately choosing a day when the kids were at her parents' house for a sleepover I'd arranged a week earlier under the pretense of giving us date night. Sandra had no idea what was coming. She came downstairs in jeans and a sweater, relaxed, expecting an actual date night, and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder in front of me and an expression she clearly hadn't anticipated. "What's going on?" she asked, and I watched her face do the thing faces do when they sense something is wrong before they have any information to explain why. "Sit down," I said. She sat, slowly, eyes on the folder. "Marcus, what is this?" I opened it and laid the contents out in front of her one piece at a time, the way I'd lay out primary sources for a class, building an argument with evidence instead of accusation. The Aldermere lounge charges. The calendar entries marked GB, debrief. A printed photo of the bracelet. A printed photo of the hotel parking lot, time-stamped, showing both of our cars, my own surveillance, taken from my phone that Tuesday night in February. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I felt, laying each piece down, the particular calm of a man who has spent months being too afraid to do this and has finally arrived at the doing of it. "I followed you to the Crestwood Suites on February 4th, I said. "I watched you go in. I watched Greg go in 4 minutes later. I watched you two through the lounge window for over an hour. I know about the Tuesday and Thursday meetings that aren't on any client list. I know about the bracelet Noah found in your purse, which I am positive I didn't buy you." Sandra stared at the table for a long moment, and when she looked up, her face had arranged itself into something composed, almost professionally so. The face I'd learned to recognize over the next hour, of a woman who handled client crises for a living and had simply redirected that skill set toward managing her own. "Okay," she said. "I need you to actually let me explain this before you decide what it means. I'm not asking for an explanation of what it means. I'm asking if it's true." "It's complicated," she said. And there it was, the word, the one that always arrives first, the one designed to slow down the conversation before it can land anywhere too final. "Greg and I have gotten close. Working that closely with someone under that kind of pressure, you build a connection. It's not what you're picturing. I watched you put your hand on his arm through a window, Sandra. That doesn't mean what you think it means." Her voice was steady, reasonable sounding, and I felt something in me tighten at how reasonable she could make herself sound while everything in front of us said otherwise. "You're building a whole narrative off a few data points without actually asking me anything. I'm asking you now, is it physical?" Pause, not long but long enough. "Define physical. Sandra. It's not some sordid affair, if that's the picture in your head," she said, and her tone shifted slightly, edging towards something almost clinical, like she was managing a difficult client call. "Greg and I have a connection that started professionally and became something more, yes, but I don't think you actually understand the context. You weren't around. You're coaching basketball 4 nights a week. You're grading papers at the kitchen table every night instead of actually talking to me. And Greg is the first person in years who's actually asked me how my day went and waited to hear the real answer. Don't make this about my coaching schedule. I'm not blaming you for this," she said quickly. Too quickly, the reflexive walkback of someone who'd heard herself land somewhere she hadn't meant to land. "I'm explaining the context, because you're sitting here with a folder like you're building a legal case, and I think you need to actually understand what's been happening instead of just cataloging it." Something in me at that exact moment, the calm composure she was performing, the clinical reasonableness of it, the folder like you're building a legal case, broke open all at once, faster than I expected, faster than I'd planned for. My voice cracked on the next sentence before I even knew it was going to. "I don't care about context right now, Sandra. I care about whether my wife has been sleeping with her boss for 5 months while I made grilled cheese for our kids." My hands were shaking. I hadn't expected that. The historian, the calm one, the man who'd built a methodical case like a court filing, suddenly unable to keep his own hands still on the table. "How long? Marcus, how long?" "Since October," she said, quieter now, watching my face carefully, recalibrating in real time. "It started in October. 5 months. I sat there with that number landing in my chest like something physical, and I felt my eyes go hot, and I didn't try to stop it the way I might have a year earlier before any of this, when I still thought of crying in front of my wife as some kind of failure. I put my head down for a moment, hands gripping the edge of the table, and when I looked up, Sandra hadn't moved to comfort me. She sat very still, watching, and something in her stillness told me she was still managing this conversation, still choosing her next move, rather than actually present inside the wreckage of it with me. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully, after letting my silence stretch for a moment. "I never planned for you to find out this way. I was going to figure out how to handle this the right way. Eventually, when the time was better, when things at work were more stable. There's no right way to tell your husband you've been having an affair, Sandra. There's just telling him or not telling him, and you chose not telling him for 5 months. I'm not saying I handled it perfectly. You're not saying you handled it badly either." She didn't answer that. I watched her decide, visibly, not to answer it, and that silence told me more than anything she'd said in the previous 10 minutes. "I need you to leave tonight," I said, my voice steadier now, the crack in it gone, replaced by something flatter and more final. "I'll figure out what to tell Noah and Lily tomorrow. But I can't be in this house with you tonight. Marcus, can we please just—" "Tonight?" I said, and stood up and walked out to the backyard in the cold without a coat, and stood there for 20 minutes looking at nothing in particular, feeling the strange relief of having finally said the thing I'd spent 5 months too afraid to say, sitting alongside a grief so total it felt almost physical, a weight pressing down on my chest that didn't lift for a long time. Sandra stayed at her sister's for the first week. I told Noah and Lily the next afternoon, sitting on the living room couch with both of them pressed against me, that Mom and Dad needed some time apart, that it wasn't anything they did, that we both loved them exactly the same as always. Noah, with the same flat directness he'd had about the smiling at her phone comment back in October, asked, "Is it because of Greg?" And I sat there for a long moment stunned, before asking how he knew that name at all, and Noah just shrugged and said, "Mom talks about him a lot." And I understood in that moment that my 9-year-old had been quietly cataloging the same evidence I had, without either of us realizing the other was watching. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Sandra asked to come by and talk. Not to move back in, just to talk, she said, because she needed me to actually understand what had happened instead of just knowing the timeline of it. I let her come, mostly for my own sake, because some part of me needed to hear it laid out fully before I could finish deciding what came next. We sat in the living room, the same couch where I'd later explained things to the kids, and she asked if she could talk without me interrupting until she was done. I said yes, mostly out of exhaustion. "I need to actually tell you how this started," she said, "because I don't think the version you've built in your head, the cold, calculating woman managing an affair like a project, is entirely fair, even though I understand exactly why you've built it. It started in early October, the week after the Hartman pitch almost fell apart. I'd worked 80 hours that week trying to save the account, and Greg was the one who stayed late with me, who actually noticed I hadn't eaten, who ordered food and sat with me at 10 at night going through slide decks. And somewhere in that exhaustion, him noticing something that simple, that I hadn't eaten, felt like more than it should have because it had been so long since anyone had noticed something that small about me. You used to notice things like that, Marcus, early on. I'm not blaming you for it stopping. I'm telling you it stopped, and I felt it stop, and I never said anything about it, and Greg noticing felt like water after a long drought. The first time he kissed me was in the parking garage after that same week, and I told myself, standing there, that it was just stress, just exhaustion finding the wrong outlet, that it would be a one-time thing we'd both regret and never repeat. That was the first lie I told myself. I believed it completely in the moment. I want you to know that I wasn't plotting an affair. I was a tired, overworked woman who let something happen once and then spent the next several weeks telling myself smaller and smaller lies about why it kept happening again. By November, when we started actually meeting at the Crestwood, I'd built an entire internal logic for it, that it was separate from our marriage, that it didn't touch you or the kids, that as long as I kept being a good mother and a present wife in the house, what happened on Tuesday and Thursday evenings existed in some sealed-off compartment that couldn't actually hurt anyone. I know how insane that sounds saying it out loud now. I believed it anyway, for months, because believing it was the only way I could keep doing both things at once without falling apart. I was scared constantly, Marcus. Every single time. I'd sit in the parking lot before going in and think, this is the last time, and then I'd go in anyway. I started lying easily in ways that frightened me about myself. I'd come home and ask Noah about his homework 40 minutes after leaving a hotel room, and some part of me had gotten frighteningly good at the transition, at compartmentalizing so completely that I almost convinced myself the two versions of my life weren't connected. There was a night in January I almost told you. You asked, completely out of nowhere, if I was happy, and it nearly broke me because the honest answer was so complicated I couldn't even begin to say it, and what came out instead was, "Of course I'm happy, why are you asking?" And I went to bed that night hating the easy lie more than I'd hated almost anything I'd done up to that point. I don't have a version of this where I tell you I was about to end it on my own. I genuinely don't know if I would have. Some part of me, when you laid out that folder on Sunday, felt something close to relief underneath all the panic, because it meant I didn't have to be the one to make it stop. I listened to all of it without interrupting, exactly as promised. And when she finished, the living room sat in a silence that felt heavier than anything either of us had said. "I believe you," I finally said. "I think that's probably the most honest thing you've told me in 5 months. But I don't think I can come back from this, Sandra. I've tried to imagine a version of us where I trust you again, and I can't get there. I think I'd spend the rest of my life checking your calendar, watching for a new lipstick, and that's not a marriage. That's a man guarding a wound that never closes." She nodded quietly, like some part of her had already known this was where the conversation would land. "I understand," she said. "I'm not going to fight you on it. We filed for divorce in April. The custody arrangement came together with less conflict than either of us expected, a week-on, week-off schedule that kept Noah and Lily in the same school district, the same friend groups, even as everything else in their family's architecture rearranged itself around them. Sandra left Halverson Creative that summer, whether by her own choice or some quiet internal pressure from leadership about a VP and a senior account director's relationship becoming office knowledge. I never asked and she never offered. Greg Bennett, I heard secondhand through a mutual acquaintance, remained at the agency, which struck me, when I learned it, as exactly the kind of unfairness the world rarely bothers to correct. There was a moment, almost 6 months after the divorce was finalized, standing in my driveway as Sandra dropped the kids off after her week, when she asked, carefully, whether there was any chance, eventually, of finding our way back to something. The leaves had just started turning, the same maple and wood smoke smell I associated with the whole town in autumn. "No," I said, gently but without hesitation, because I'd had 8 months to sit with the question and the answer had only become more certain, not less. "I don't think there is. Not because I'm trying to punish you, because I genuinely don't think I'd ever stop watching you for the next lie, even on the days there wasn't one. And you deserve better than a husband who's quietly auditing you for the rest of your life, and I deserve better than spending the rest of mine doing it." She nodded, eyes wet, and said, "Okay." And that was, more or less, the last conversation between us that wasn't strictly logistical. The clearest red flag, looking back, was never the lipstick or the calendar entries. It was the speed and polish of Sandra's explanations every single time I came close to asking a real question. A genuinely innocent person fumbles a little when accused of something they didn't do. What unsettled me, even before I had proof, was how seamlessly her explanations arrived, fully formed, requiring no further inquiry. I noticed that ease in real time and mistook it for honesty, when it was actually the opposite, the practiced fluency of someone who has rehearsed the lie because she's had to use it before. The second flag I missed for months was my own retreat into work. I told myself coaching basketball and grading papers until 10 at night was simply who I was, a dedicated teacher, a responsible provider. Looking back, it was also a convenient place to put my attention so I didn't have to sit in a quiet house and notice what was actually happening to my marriage. Sandra wasn't wrong that I disappeared into my own obligations. She was wrong that this disappearance obligated her to find comfort in someone else's attention rather than naming the gap to me directly. Both things can be true at once. My absence created room, and her choice to fill that room with Greg was still entirely her choice. The real turning point in the marriage wasn't October, when the affair started, or even February, when I confronted her. It was sometime earlier and quieter than either of those, the unnamed month when we both stopped asking each other how we were actually doing and settled instead for the comfortable shorthand of a functioning household. We paid bills together, coordinated school pickups, attended recitals side by side, and mistook that functioning for connection, right up until one of us found something more compelling on the other side of an office building. What I take from this, more than anger at Sandra or grief over what we lost, is a harder lesson about my own habits. That avoiding hard conversations doesn't protect a relationship, it just defers the cost and lets it compound silently until the bill arrives all at once, far larger than it would have been if I'd asked the small, uncomfortable question back in September instead of waiting 5 months to ask the unbearable one in February. What still catches me, even now, is how much of this happened in plain sight. Not hidden in some clever, undetectable way, but happening right there in a calendar entry, a credit card statement, a 9-year-old's offhand comment about a smile. I think that's true of most betrayals, actually. They're rarely as hidden as the people living through them assume. The evidence is almost always available. What's missing is usually the will to look at it directly, because looking costs something that not looking doesn't, at least not yet. I don't carry the same anger towards Sandra now that I did in February. I carry something closer to a clear-eyed sadness for the marriage, for the version of her that sat alone in a parking garage telling herself it was just stress, for the version of me that spent 5 months building elaborate alternate explanations instead of asking one direct question. If there's a single thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take away, it's not a warning about lipstick or hotel bars. It's simpler. When something in your gut tells you to look closer at a pattern you've been quietly building for weeks. Look. The cost of looking is always smaller than the cost of finding out months later exactly how much you already knew and chose not to.